I love that Norbert Chickett began by talking about the spirit that turns the seed or places in the seed that which becomes the tree. Because we've seen that in the animal kingdom in our household recently. We had an unfortunate incident where somebody stole our bird off the porch. And my response to that is always to go look immediately for a new bird. We went to the pet shop to report the theft in case somebody was going to try to sell it to them. I said, "Do you have any lovebirds that you've been feeding here?" The lady said, "We have just this one, but we're going to have to send him back or her back because she's got a bad foot." I said, "What will happen if you send her back?" And they said, "Well, she'll be put down." I said, "Show me your bird." And long story short, we adopted Neela. And Neela looked different to us from any other lovebird we've had because we've never had one that was that young. She was just weeks old. And now she's sleeking down. We've been able to get her to eat seeds now and all the good things that she needs. She's beginning to fly. And so the seed that turns into the oak tree is present in birds too. And we had a little baby that we were feeding out of a dropper. And now she's becoming the bird that we hoped she would become. So we're really happy with Levi. I'm going to give a little bit of a history lesson. Bonhoeffer lived the generation before mine, and there's background here about Germany. Most of you are pretty clued into the current political situation in America, and it has such echoes of the German people believing the big lie, which in their case doesn't speak well for them because the big lie was that the Nazis would do something about the problem of degeneracy in their country, and then they blamed everybody but them. Everybody but white Christian Lutherans were the degenerates, and a few Catholics, I guess. But Bonhoeffer was up that. He was probably in his 30s when this all got going there with the Nazis. So I'm going to lead up to that and then talk about that a little bit. The longest period of peace in modern European history lasted from 1871, that was the end of the Franco-Prussian War, to 1914 with the outbreak of World War I. But that was over 40 years of peace in Europe. That's the good news. The bad news is that the French so deeply resented the loss to the Prussians of that territory, which became known as Alsace-Lorraine, on their eastern border with Germany, that they were more than happy to go to war in 1914 in hopes of regaining that territory. They went to war with Germany, but what you and I now call Germany is actually a coalition of smaller states brought together by Otto von Bismarck in the course of that Franco-Prussian War that consolidated Germany. The good news for that coalition of states was that they had considerable success in generating great wealth through industrialization during those 4 decades of peace between 1871 and 1914. The bad news was that industrialization throughout the Western world during that period resulted in the development of weapons that were so destructive to the human body that a large percentage of an entire generation of young men in Europe died when war finally did break out. The weapons I'm referring to were the machine gun, the armored tank, and the airplane. In 1906, a son was born to one of those prosperous German families, the Bonhoeffers. They named this little boy Dietrich. They had other children, of course. Dietrich Bonhoeffer grew up to be a brilliant young man who would become one of the leading theologians of his generation. But there's a catch to that story, because Dietrich would defy the way theology was being pursued in the Lutheran Church during his formative years. He would establish a much more personal approach to Christianity, which he called the confessing church. And because the Lutheran Church in Germany would eventually identify itself exclusively with the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler, Dietrich would be in effect excommunicated by the church and then killed at the hands of the Nazis, hanged as an enemy of the state on April 9th, 1945. Now that date gives me chills for two reasons. Less than 1 month later, the war in Europe was over. Sensing that the end was coming, Hitler and Goebbels were adamant about executing Bonhoeffer and his Confederates before the Nazi leaders committed suicide at the end of the month of April. But I also shiver because the wonderful teacher and thinker Dietrich Bonhoeffer died just 17 days before I was born. So he died in the month that I was born. Now, you might ask what Bonhoeffer and I would have had in common. But if we look at the circumstances into which we were born, we don't have much in common. He was born to a wealthy family. My parents were married well. They were both contributing to the war effort. When I came along near the end of the war, we ended up scrambling for housing and food. Went from a trailer in my Aunt Kate's backyard to a small apartment in a veterans housing project. We thought we were really moving up in the world. The Bonhoeffers, on the other hand, enjoyed a cultivated lifestyle that included a summer home in the mountains, box seats at the opera, a mind-boggling level of expenditure that, when extrapolated to the larger culture in the years prior to World War I, raises one big question. Why in the world would the Germans go to war when they seem to have had it made? Now, there's quite a lot of talk about what Germany lost in the wake of World War I, but oddly enough, for people at the socioeconomic level of the Bonhoeffers, life went on pretty much as it had. When Dietrich had finished his theological studies and was assigned in the late 1920s to a parish church in Barcelona, this was a Lutheran church for expatriates who were living there, he said he'd never seen people so visibly impressed with their own wealth. And that statement is coming from a fellow who periodically petitioned his wealthy parents for a higher allowance for travel and fashionable clothing. If this kid was disgusted by conspicuous consumption among German expatriates, you know it had reached epic levels. The Barcelona Experience, which was kind of an internship for Bonhoeffer, brought out a talent for working with young people that would serve him well as he progressed in his career. It also brought him in contact with a group that he might never have been in contact with under other circumstances. Small-time criminals, sex workers, and other individuals from the demi-monde who came to him seeking spiritual counsel. This was Barcelona, after all. It was during this period of preparing and delivering weekly sermons in Barcelona that Dietrich began to develop his unique approach to theology. He had previously studied under mostly conservative Lutheran theologians who, in his words, reduced the self to an empty vessel into which God merely poured his grace. Dietrich believed in the restless soul that follows its instinct toward morality and self-discovery. In his words, an anxious questioning for divine things. Sounds a little bit like Unitarian Universalist. The one teacher whose ideas rang true for Bonhoeffer was Karl Barth, B-A-R-T-H. Barth interpreted the human condition in the light of the incarnation, humanism infused with the Word made flesh. Bonhoeffer would come to feel that God's merciful gift of grace required a spiritual change of heart on behalf of the individual. This process seems to be referred to as justification in theological circles. I take that to mean that the individual justifies God's confidence in him or her by showing that the gift of grace has transformed the individual into a spiritual questioner. There's going to be a quiz afterwards, so it's good that you're listening. In 1931, Dietrich took advantage of an opportunity to study in America at Union Theological Seminary. That's in New York City. Did you hear of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation? I think Alfred P. Sloan was associated with Union Theological Seminary. Now, Dietrich was totally disdainful of the level of theological study in America. Once he learned how it was being taught and so on in Union Theological Seminary, he was slightly disgusted by their lack of rigor, I guess you might say. But one of his professors, Reinhold Niebuhr, impressed him mightily with his call for social action on behalf of workers devastated by the Great Depression. Niebuhr called for a public theology. In the summer of 1931, Niebuhr spoke at 4 black colleges in the South under the sponsorship of the American Missionary Society. And Dietrich began reading the works of black writers. He was there in New York City at the time of the Harlem Renaissance. He became friendly with Franklin Fisher. Now, Fisher was the son of the pastor of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. The younger Fisher was a pastoral intern at Abyssinian Baptist Church there in Harlem. That was an institution with an astounding 7,000 members. A little bit different scene from what we have today here. At that church, Dietrich came in contact with African American worship services and with the seriousness of African American theologians. He had never seen such joy in worship and such a degree of participation in the service. As fate would have it, the minister of the Abyssinian Baptist Church, Adam Clayton Powell Sr., had recently undergone a change in emphasis in his ministry. He had begun to dwell on Jesus as the one who wandered into distressed and lonely places to share the struggles of the poor, as a friend and counselor. As he did with the ministry of Reinhold Niebuhr, Dietrich absorbed the practice of Adam Clayton Powell Sr. He taught a Sunday school class at Powell's church, as well as a Wednesday evening women's Bible study. And on one occasion, he even delivered a sermon from the pulpit of the Abyssinian Baptist Church on a Sunday morning. Moreover, he traveled to Washington, D.C. with Franklin Fisher to meet other black writers and theologians, then took a long trip south with another friend, attending services in small African American churches. All in all, Dietrich's year in America exposed him to what was missing in German theology, a grounding in everyday reality. Back in Germany, Dietrich locked horns with Karl Barth over Barth's contention that Christian theology bore no responsibility to change society. Dietrich had now come to believe that the true Christian must receive Christ into his or her heart and proceed with the work of repairing the world in all its brokenness. His arguments with Barth were good-natured, but his dedication to a Christianity guided by the Sermon on the Mount set him on a collision course with the Nazis, as the latter group put more and more pressure on the Lutheran Church in Germany to declare its fealty to the Fuhrer. Hitler ascended to power on January 30th, 1933, and immediately called for the removal of all Jews from civil service, including those Jews who had converted to Christianity. The Lutheran Church accepted what was called the Arian paragraph and began excluding Jews from communion. This was the first step toward what would come to be known as the final solution. And the church was in lockstep with Hitler as he pursued the ultimate descent into inhumanity. In the end, Dietrich was virtually alone among German theologians in denouncing the National Socialist captivity of the church. By June of 1933, most of Dietrich's colleagues and former classmates were card-carrying Nazis. In July, he received his first visit from the Gestapo. His spiritual leadership of dissenters began during this period, but he did take the expedient step of accepting a post to minister to 2 Lutheran churches in London. Thus, he was out of the country when the first loyalty oath to the Führer was required of German clergy. Still, the mere suspicion that he would not be signing caused Dietrich to be declared a Staatsfeind, an enemy of the state. When he returned to Germany, Dietrich got himself assigned to the task of reviving one of the languishing seminaries located as far north as could be, in a place called Finkenwalde. That kept him out of the orbit of the Gestapo for a while. And it permitted him to develop and preach to young ministers his Christ-centered version of their faith. At that point, he wrote to his brother, "I do believe that at last, for the first time in my life, I'm on the right track." One of the sermons that he preached during that period was entitled, "The Church is Dead." Little wonder that his books were about to be banned in Germany and his right to practice the ministry terminated. Finkenwalde proved to be the site of another of his important steps forward in the Christian faith. His biographer, Charles Marsh, puts it this way: Bonhoeffer, whose insatiable hunger for intimate friendship had led him to this lovely tract of land in Upper Pomerania, now made community his art, with beauty and discipline as complementary elements. He was forming a new kind of fellowship within the Lutheran Church, in other words. He found the canvas on which to render his personal ideal of a Christian community. And it was at Finkenwalde that Dietrich fell in love. Among the 23 young men in that first class at the seminary was Eberhard Bethke, a minister's son from rural Saxony. He would be Dietrich's close confidant for the rest of his life. It's pretty much all downhill from here, I'm afraid. In December 1935, Heinrich Himmler signed a decree declaring that all training centers for the confessing church were to be closed, all participants in them liable to punishment. In July 1936, the arrests began. At first, the young ministers were held in concentration camps and then released. The Berlin Olympics began on August 1st, 1936, and Joseph Goebbels ordered the most extreme and obvious practices of the Nazi Party against dissenters and Jews to be soft-pedaled in order to ensure the best possible treatment of the party in the worldwide press. But in February 1937, the real crackdown began. One of Dietrich's friends was executed for declaring himself a conscientious objector. Karl Barth was prudent in escaping to a teaching post in Switzerland. In February 1938, Dietrich made his first contact with the German resistance. The people he worked with were in a section of German military intelligence called the Abwehr. Kristallnacht was December 9th, 1938. That was the night when the police were told to look the other way as German citizens looted anything that Jews were dealing from, stores and so on, as well as people's houses. That was November 9th, 1938. And it wasn't the police who did the looting, it was the German people who did the looting, while the police looked the other way. Dietrich actually slipped off to New York for 2 months in 1939 while his draft status was being finalized, but he returned to Germany in July, determined to do what he could to defeat the Nazis from within. Dietrich wrote to a friend during this period that he was taking each day as if it were the last, and yet living it faithfully and responsibly as if there were to be a great future. Sounds like us right now, doesn't it? I don't mean to belittle the obvious threat to his life, but that description of his state of mind resembles what a lot of people have been expressing in America over the past 2 years. Dietrich's theological attitude at this point is summed up in his statement that to find Christ, a person must become righteous, suffering for the sake of justice, truth, and humanity. He added that discipleship is the path to consummate humans. During this period of working with the au pair, Dietrich was assigned to try to convince the English and the American high commands that they should support the au pair in their efforts to do away with Hitler. But sadly, the Allies never took seriously the idea of a German resistance. And part of that was they couldn't assure themselves that whoever took over if Hitler was put down would be any better. So Dietrich was arrested by the Gestapo on April 4th, 1943. From prison, he wrote this: "In the end, the world is summed up in a few people one wishes to see and with whom one wishes to be together." He felt that theology's task was to preserve the eternal mystery in a catastrophically demystified time. There's a quote from him: "Faith begins with simple, grateful praise of God as the mystery of the world. God who exists beyond necessity and desire." He fervently believed that the church's word gains weight and power not through concepts, but by example. On April 9th, 1945, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and 5 other members of the resistance were hanged. Though he was willing to die in the effort to oppose the Nazis, he believed strongly in peace and once said that peace is the great adventure, but peace is not found by the way of security. I believe Dietrich Bonhoeffer did find peace. He certainly eschewed the way of security by returning from the safe haven of New York to carry out his part in what he hoped would be the liberation of his country from the grip of evil. There's an old joke about a person having the confidence of a Christian holding 4 aces. I think we all know that real confidence, real courage, requires a lot more from us than drawing a lucky hand at poker. Real courage requires action in the face of withering uncertainty. Dietrich Bonhoeffer gave us a shining example of that kind of courage and daring. I mentioned earlier that he died the month I was born. I hope when my time comes to die that I will be able to say that in some small way, I've been worthy of carrying that torch of enlightened humanity that he, in a sense, handed to me. In closing, I'd like to mention my friend Herb Hobbs. He was the chaplain at the college where Martha and I taught. And before I was even functioning as a faculty member, Herb had me playing music at an opening ceremony that they had. But he was the person who steered me in the direction of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And Herb certainly embodied those traits that he admired in Bonhoeffer. I was so happy to finally connect with him recently by phone, and I know his spirit is with us here today. Herbert G. Hobbs. I'm really happy to be with you, to be able to talk to you about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who is a worthy role model for us all. Thank you.